All right, good afternoon, everyone. This is Mike Dane with MLS Technology. Today we're going to be going through the Add Edit class. This afternoon's class is only going to be an hour long. I did want to actually just run through a couple basics about the actual webinar system itself first before we actually get into the course content. Also give everybody a chance to get signed in. It looks like we're only missing a couple people at this point, but so everybody's going to be starting on mute by default. I wanted to mention that there's going to be a couple different options for you to be able to interact. First and foremost, we have the option up there for Q&A. If you guys notice down there at the bottom of your screen, there's going to be a little Q&A button. If you do end up having any questions, please make sure that you try and put those into the Q&A section, primarily just because that chat option, which is better for comments, examples, any anecdotes that you guys might want to share, that doesn't give me as much of a notification or obvious questions being asked. So if you ask a question in the chat, I might not actually even see it in time. Whereas with the Q&A, it's got a couple different options for me. We can make sure that your question gets answered and in a timely manner. I also wanted to point out the session will be recorded. So if you guys would like to kind of watch this after the fact, make sure that you've got everything that you need, you can always just double check on that, make sure that you're following along with how we were doing the video or whatnot. Also, if you guys have any audio or video issues during the course, please make sure that I'm aware as quickly as possible. We want to ensure that everybody's able to get the CE credit for the class today. And the most important thing, the problem that we seem to run into the most frequently is that people got disconnected or they weren't able to hear or see what was going on, and subsequently that caused them not to be able to get the CE credit. So make sure that if you guys have any issues, reach out to me either in the chat, Q&A, worst case scenario, you have to get in contact with us over at the service desk. Just make sure that I'm aware, make sure that we're aware that you're having problems, because if you are, you might not be the only one. So also, we wanted to mention, if you guys do have need to make sure that you've got your CE credit, we get that information sent off pretty quickly right after class is over. But if you don't see that it's been applied before the end of the month, you can always get in contact with OREC to make sure. At this point, we typically don't have too many delays on our end, but can't rule that out. Always get in contact with us first and foremost if you don't see it by even the end of next week. But in the interim, I wanted to point out some of the buttons that we're going to be discussing with today. Again, Q&A, any questions that you guys have, chat for any commentary, and then of course the raise hand option if you guys would like to get unmuted. If you do want to get unmuted, since this is a relatively short class, please try to keep your questions very targeted and focused in. But again, I don't want you guys to feel like you can't ask a question, especially if typing things out might take a little while, or it's a nuanced question, or multiple parts, whatever. We want to make sure that everybody's getting what they need out of this. Additionally, if you guys are joining us on a mobile device, there's going to be the exact same options. The only difference is that you have to tap the screen in order for those to appear. So if you guys would like to ask a question on your mobile device, you can always hit that Q&A button. All the more important since the little keyboards are so small and annoying on the Q&A. There's a little raise hand option as well. You can get unmuted from there. All right. I believe we actually have everybody that was hoping to attend. Let me quick run through real quick. Looks like we're still missing one person. Okay, so I'm going to hold off on starting the course content because that's actually effectively when we start the timer on the CE credit. Yeah, that's all right. Oh, and actually, you know what? Here, we can do this poll in the interim. All right, so I'm going to be launching a poll. Nicole, I think it appears that you're actually signed in twice, but I didn't know if that was intentional or something. But anyway, make sure that you guys respond to that poll. That poll is going to be a part of how we justify the CE credit for the class. So please make sure that you guys have all responded. Excellent. All right, looks like we got everybody's response. All right, we're going to go ahead and get started with the content itself. Just as a heads up, it looks like at least the majority of you guys are new, or at least relatively new to the real estate industry. And it looks like also a majority of you guys have ad edit permissions already. For those of you guys who are not sure, that's okay. The easiest and quickest way to find out if you do have those permissions is if you go into Add Edit and you click on this Add New button. It's going to tell you a little error message saying, if you don't have permission to edit this listing or something. It literally won't even let you get to this particular screen that we're seeing right here. Now, even if you don't have that Add Edit permission, not to worry. All that means is just that your broker needs to put in a request to us at the service desk. We have all the forms and paperwork that you guys can fill out. So pretty cut and dry. If that does turn out to be the case, it's very simple. It's something that we can apply within a matter of minutes as long as we have the right paperwork. But let's go ahead and get started with the course content. So I wanted to just give you guys a quick little introduction to all of this. So the add edit function in Matrix has actually been locked down. This is a little bit of a unique situation here with our MLS. The vast majority of MLSs in the country actually allow for all of their members to just add and edit their own listings due to a couple larger offices with their own reasons, I guess. We have it locked down, so the permissions do actually have to be requested for our MLS. This may change eventually where, we're going to have the exact opposite, where if everybody in the MLS wants to have added permission, except for those larger offices where they will have to effectively ask us not to allow people to have permissions. That might be the ideal. I'm not sure that we're going to be getting there anytime soon, but might be worth something to voice your opinion on if you guys are a part of committees or have anybody that you work with that is. But in the interim, everybody will have to ask for those permissions. And for those of you guys who do have those permissions, we want to make sure that everybody that has access to the adding and editing of listings, that you guys know how to use the system and ensure that you guys are making listings that contain useful information for not only yourself, but also for your fellow realtors to use, to view them, to make sales, to find out what compensation is, to find out what the attributes of the properties are. There's just a lot of information. So we're going to be going over a decent amount of the data entry part. But today is primarily going to be focused on that technical aspect, so the actual data entry. We won't be lingering too long on our rules and regulations surrounding the entry, but if you do end up wanting to find out more about the statuses, any of the stipulations on entering listings, or even just avoiding violations, I did want to point you guys to where you can find those rules and regulations. Now we're going to jump back over to our MLS portal. So again, the first place that you guys land when you sign into the system. And a little further down, there's going to be the governing documents and forms and contracts. We're going to be spending a lot of time in both of these, or in the forms and contracts, excuse me. But let's click on governing documents. And there's going to be the MLS Tech rules and regs. This is the foundational document of our entire MLS, how we function. I did want to point out just a couple things. First and foremost, everything that we're going to be discussing today is going to be referred to as broker load. What that means is that you as the agent are entering a listing for the broker. There is an alternative option called central load where the MLS will actually be entering that data. There's a fee related to that. There's a couple extra complications to it. So the broker load, which is what we'll be discussing today, it's a lot easier, at least as far as what you guys have access to, so that you're not having to put in all these weird requests all the time just to change something that you could have easily put in yourself. We also have all of our statuses defined. Notably, there is a whole section here on closed listings. This is one of the most confusing parts that a lot of people don't seem to understand, or oftentimes seem to oblige. Listings that are being entered for statistical purposes have to have been closed already. We have been noticing a huge trend recently of people entering listings that are being entered as supposedly statistical purposes listings, and they're just entered and then put into pending. This is not allowed. This is a rule that we've actually stood by for, as you guys can see, pretty long time. This is actually just an update. These rules were actually entered a long time before that with only minor modification. But just as a reminder, if you guys are going to be putting in a listing that's going to be just entered for statistical purposes, you didn't need to market it or have it be something that's posted to the public. Those listings have to have already been closed. It has to have been within the last 5 business days, and you're going to have to make sure that it's explicitly labeled as entered for statistical purposes. A lot of people have been trying to work around some of the cooperation and compensation that the MLS is based around just by putting in those listings as pending and then just leaving them sitting there. This is not allowed. We catch them. They're painfully easy to find even. So just please oblige those rules. It is for everybody's benefit. But if you guys have any questions about when certain listings are meant to be in certain states, just come back to visit this section. It's section 2.2 in our rules and regs. Another kind of sticking point that we've noticed a lot of people kind of get hung up on is the pending status. The most common thing that we've been hearing people say is that, well, my listing is still active because they haven't gotten the earnest money or there's some kind of financial holdup or something. But as long as the contract, the sales contract has been signed by both the buyer and the seller, it is supposed to be in pending. Period. End of story. That's it. I don't mean to sound too aggressive about all of this. It's just that these rules are causing a cascading effect, especially the pending side of things, because if you've got a listing that's still marked as active and some buyer out there is really interested in the property, but meanwhile the earnest money hasn't been delivered or there's financing holdups or whatever else, but the property can't be shown, it can't take any extra offers or whatever the case may be, it's going to end up causing people to have a bad reputation because those buyers are going to assume that there's something wrong with the agent that they were working with, which again undercuts the value of the realtors and so on and so forth. So again, please make sure that you guys are putting things into the proper status at the proper time. There are some other rules directly related to that in regards to like when you're supposed to put things into pending, when you're supposed to put things into closed, etc. But we'll be discussing some of that stuff a little bit later. The only other thing that I really wanted to point out to you guys was 2.25. Here it is. Okay. Section 2.25, errors or omissions on listings. Actually, let me make this a little larger so we can read this. MLS tech shall not be liable for errors or omissions contained in the MLS. It's the responsibility of the listing participant to check his or her listing. If there is an error or omission on a listing, the following action shall be taken. Again, MLS enters listings for people under a term called central load. Everything that you guys will be doing is going to be entered as a broker load. So if you guys do have a listing that you've entered and you find that there's some kind of problem with it, some inaccuracy, you must immediately correct that listing. So one of the, maybe just more of a personal pet peeve of mine is incorrect mapping. A lot of people have been complaining about how things have not been mapping properly, but we've also been noticing that there's maybe missing pieces of data on the address, or people just aren't going back to actually check where the mapping put their listing. It's really simple. I would always recommend that you guys know exactly where it is on the map, because that's going to be how people are going to get to the property. It's by mapping it out to the correct location. If it's not mapped in the right location, then people are going to have some trouble actually going to do showings, right? So always make sure that you guys are double checking your listings, make sure that all the attributes, all the features, all the data about this listing is up to date, correct, and put in correctly. All right, so that's it for now for our rules. Let's actually quickly jump over to our property data form. So before we even get the opportunity to start adding all of the listing data into the system, we want to ensure that you guys have access to all the listing data that you can fill out, as well as a little reminder on what parts and pieces of that data are going to be required for each listing. All of that can be found under the Forms and Contracts section, and then under the MLS specific forms. Now, under MLS specific forms, we have some basic things, including an MLS change form we'll be discussing later, the firm exclusive form for those times whenever a client is actually not willing, or at least maybe not ready for their listing to be added into the MLS and be marketed publicly. And then there's also a sales fee agreement for again, those situations where you have somebody that's got a for sale by owner that wants to sell, but the buyer's end has a uh, agent on the other end. Those listings can, in fact, actually be entered into our system through the statistical purposes listings. We'll just need to have a sales fee agreement that's been signed on it. But when you guys are entering the listing data to begin with, you're going to be using these matrix data forms. Now, the matrix data forms come in 4 different flavors. We've got it in residential, vacant land, residential leasing, and then commercial sales. So the residential, vacant, and commercial are all going to be sales, and the leasing, again, is just going to be for residential leasing. Each of these has their own independent elements that are going to be specific to this property type. So like residential and residential leasing are both going to have elements that are directly related to bedroom count, bathroom count, so on and so forth. Vacant land, on the other hand, is going to be a lot more targeted towards some of the questions as to what can you put on the land? What is it zoned as? What's actually occupying the land right now as far as farmland goes? And then, of course, the commercial side of things is going to be interested in what kind of business it was, what are the operating costs, how many square footage it is, what's the frontage to the road, all sorts of different details. Again, each of these is going to be specifically created for that property type. Now, for our example today, I'm going to be choosing the most complex of them, which is going to be the residential form. Residential is going to be marginally more complicated than the leasing option, but both of them are going to have a lot of crossover. So when we get into this residential form, this is going to show us all of the information that our system can contain about each and every listing. Most importantly on each of these forms is going to be these little asterisks indicating whether or not something is truly required for each listing. So for instance, if it's coming soon, yes or no, who the listing agent is, who the office is, but notably, we don't actually require any listing team names. We also have a section a little bit further down that's going to have some contextually required information. So for instance, if you are going to indicate that there's a kitchen and you want to indicate which of the parts and pieces of a kitchen are included in this particular property, you're also going to have to include what the floor is that this particular room is on. So the dining room, probably the first floor, sure, but we need to make sure that that's marked if you guys are going to cite that there's a dining room that has a breakfast nook. Or if you guys have a master bedroom that has a separate closet, we need to know what floor that's on. There's also a couple other sections like the HOA mandatory. You'll notice that all of the rest of these all are listed as contextually required, because if the HOA is mandatory, we need to know if there's an HOA fee, we need to know what the schedule is, whether they can refuse it, if there's pets allowed, any of the amenities, blah, 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 blah. So all of these, again, are going to be directly related to other elements. We'll take a look at what that is going to appear as whenever we're actually adding a listing in. But I'm going to leave this up for now just so we can see, again, what the paperwork will actually say. Now, we have had some questions about this in the past, and I just want to make it clear. Filling out this property data form is actually not a requirement. You do not have to have the paperwork that has the initial details from the seller or even just from your own inspection of the property. But I did want to reinforce that even if you guys, don't have to fill one of these out, it's incredibly beneficial to make sure that you have all this information so that you're not sitting there with your client having to call them up when you're putting in the data and be like, hey, so do you know what the energy type is of your property? Does it have any energy, details or something like that? And then they're having to kind of scramble to try and find it and get it all on the paperwork. You can send this off to the client to have them fill out part of it. You can fill it out yourself, whatever you would like. I do know that there's some offices that have turned this into a digital form that you can fill out. And we similarly also have a version of this that you can fill out on the transaction desk system. For, I think, a couple of you guys at least, you were in the transaction desk class earlier today. And you guys can actually go through the process of filling out the property data form through transaction desk. And one of the coolest things about this is that once you guys have filled this information out, there is a button up here at the top for those of you guys who have ad edit permission already, to take any of the information that you've filled in here and then just immediately turn it into a listing. It'll be an incomplete listing with all the data that you've provided. So it makes life a million times easier than having to go through and fill this in by hand and then copy it into the computer by typing things out. You can just do the typing once, hit the button, it automatically creates an uploaded listing, and you're good to go. Simplifies the whole process a lot. All right, so back in Matrix, I'm going to go to our add edit phase. And we're actually going to start off with a brand new listing. So I'm going to click on this add new. And you'll notice that this is broken down into, again, the exact same 4 categories we just discussed: residential sales, commercial sales, vacant land sales, and then residential leasing. So I'm going to click on the residential sale. And this leads us to the very first step of adding in a new listing into the system. We can either import data from a previous listing, which is going to save you guys an immense amount of time, because instead of you having to go through and manually fill everything out, you effectively just have to confirm that the information is correct. So what you would do is just put in whatever the previous listing number was, hit fill from, and the data will just automatically be grabbed as much as it can get from this previous listing. Saves you a lot of time. Alternatively, we also have an option to just run a search for it. There's a address search right up here at the top. If you guys would like to use the address search, this will again save you guys a lot of time. So like for instance, if I typed in the address I always seem to use for our classes, 1373 Riverside Drive, I hit search. It's going to see if it can find any previous listings for this property. Oh, I left active checked, excuse me. There we go. And I can just grab some of the data from one of these previous listings by clicking fill. Similarly, we also have a fill from tax option. This one's going to be just a regular matrix tax record search. So if I wanted to do the exact same thing I just did, 1573 Riverside, run the search. This is going to provide me with the exact same data, except it's going to be a little bit pared down. Because again, the tax information isn't going to ask for nearly as much as what we actually allow in our listing data. So it's going to be absent maybe some of the key elements that you might need. You're still going to end up having to ask the seller about stuff. So this is a great start if you guys don't have a previous listing on it. But again, the preferred method is to grab from a previous listing. There's also a fill from realist tax. Just as a heads up, the fill from tax and then fill from realist tax do exactly the same functionality, but I have found that there's more data that comes over with the fill from tax than the fill from realist tax, just because of the way that realist is tied into matrix. We actually added this fill from tax option relatively recently, I think probably in the last like month and a half or something. But in our case, we're actually going to leave all of this empty. We're just going to start off with a completely blank listing. So if you guys have new construction or vacant land that's been built on, or whatever the case may be, you can go over here to start with a blank listing, and it's going to end up with this wizard. The wizard is actually going to be laid out kind of like a couple of the other systems that we have in Matrix, but just as a heads up, it's going to start us off with our status, and then we can start filling out our property information, then rules, broker disclosure, HOA, so on and so forth. But it starts us off with this status because the very first thing that we need to define is whether or not this particular listing is going to be either active when we hit submit listing, or if it's going to be coming soon and then become active within the next 10 days. Now, the coming soon section of our rules and regulations starts at 2.5. And just as a heads up, here's 2.5, 2.5.1, 2.5.2, 3, 4. There's a whole lot. I mean, it's more than a page and a half worth of information on just how to handle coming soon listings. There's a lot of different ways that they've kind of closed this up so that we prevent any kind of unethical behavior, or, at least as far as we're concerned, kind of impractical behavior. But the coming soon listings boil down to the basic premise of I have a listing, it's not ready to be shown, and I'm not going to be taking any offers on it until X date. This is what's referred to as the showing start date. So if we were to leave this particular listing in a coming soon status, so that when we hit submit listing, it becomes coming soon, it's going to have a showing start date, at which point the listing will automatically turn into an active listing. Now, this does have to be within the next 10 days. So we have a listing that's going to be going active 10 days from now. That's perfectly acceptable. An important note is that the listing information cannot be moved backwards. That's actually one of the things that we mentioned in the rules here. Yeah, see, it's 2.5.2 3E. So the showing start date once entered cannot be modified backwards earlier than intended. Now, that doesn't mean that you can't move it forwards. So this isn't just a hard, fast rule that you have to use the 10 days. If you guys would like, you can actually have a listing that's going to go active in the next 5 days, for instance. And if the client gets in contact with you and says, hey, you know what, I hate to say this, but we didn't end up finishing the painting or cleaning or whatever it was that they were trying to prep for in time, you can still move the date forward. The reason why we don't want people to move the date backwards, and literally the system won't let you move the date backwards, is because we actually have agents that are going to be looking through the coming soon listings, despite the fact that there's so few of them. They will be looking through those coming soon listings and may end up trying to schedule for a buyer to come out on the showing start date. So if we end up having somebody that moves the showing start date backwards, and then of course the market being what it is right now, they end up saying, hey, you know, I've got an offer, I've got a seller or a buyer, excuse me, let's go ahead and cut a deal. And the listing goes pending before it was even supposed to go active. That could cause a really big issue. Again, just like I mentioned before, we want to try and make sure that we're not, you know, causing significant issues with trust and problems with the other people that we're actually supposed to be cooperating, compensating with our real estate transactions. So again, we cannot move the dates back. We're not going to allow it. There's not going to be any way to finagle around it. That's just how we have this set up. And just as a heads up, all of these rules come directly from the National Association of Realtors. We've made minor adjustments to a couple of the things just to ensure that it kind of falls in line with some of the other rules that we have in our MLS. But all of the coming soon rules are effectively just boiling down to what NAR has recommended to us. So anyway, we're going to leave it on coming soon for now, just so I can show you guys on this property info page the only thing that changes. So a little bit further down on the page, we have our list price, list date, expiration date, and then there's something called the showing start date. If we have it left on coming soon, you'll notice that this yellow here is actually highlighted on the showing start date. This yellow on all of these spaces is indicating that this is a required field. So if I were to go back and actually click on the active status and then jump back into our property info, you can see that this is now not even a field I can enter anything into. It's literally just grayed out. It's no longer yellow indicating it's required. It's just blocked out. Because if you're going to be changing the listing over to an active status, the moment you hit submit listing, it becomes a real listing, gets propagated out to all the third-party websites. Everybody on the public side can view it. It's a good to go listing. All right. So on this property info page, it's mostly a bunch of cut and dry information. I did want to point out a couple of weird things about this. So in our case, I'm actually going to show us the, let's just do 1, 2, 3. And then for the street name, you notice I can't actually click here to type anything. It's not actually allowing me. In order for us to enter a street name in for this particular listing, I'm actually going to have to click this auto fill street name button. What this will do is actually open up a little window here, and I can just type in Maine. There might even be a drop down here trying to indicate what the autofill is trying to do for us. We can hit run search and it'll provide us the street's name. I just click this little fill button and that's it. Now, sometimes people are kind of curious as to why we have done this. And I did want to clarify the street name section used to be something that people would misuse either intentionally or not. We would have a lot of people that would misspell things. Sometimes people would misspell things intentionally. So instead, what we did is just decided to create a massive compendium of all of the streets names in the entirety of Oklahoma. There are still a lot of gaps. There's still new construction. There's still counties that we haven't covered quite yet. But effectively what this boils down to is that if you end up trying to enter a listing and the street's name is not actually filling in there, get in contact with us, let us know. We're going to ask where this is on the map on a tax record. And if we can find it, we'll add it. So that way nobody has to worry about like not being able to put in the street that they intended to use or whatever the case may be. Street type is also kind of a recent trend. For some reason, people have just been leaving off the street type. I don't know why. It's definitely not beneficial. And as I mentioned before, we've had a lot of properties that have been mismapping. And part of the reason that is because people have been just leaving off the street type for, again, whatever reason. I'm not sure why. We also have a subdivision section. You'll notice this autofill street name matches our autofill subdivision. Similar to the street name, we've had a lot of issues with misspelled street or subdivisions and a few other issues with just even codifying that data to begin with. So when you click on this autofill subdivision, I did want to point out it brings up pretty much the exact same thing that autofill street name did, except it's going to be county specific information. Because there's going to be Main Street in a bunch of different areas throughout Oklahoma. There's probably going to be a J Street in a bunch of different rural communities. There's probably going to be a bunch of places that are named after Harvard, Yale, whatever. But with the subdivisions, there's a lot of specificity. So for instance, if I were to type in Minchell Park, we've got Minchell Park 1, 2, 3, 4, or resub, 5 part resub, Granite Hill resub, Minchell Park 2. Like there's just a huge variety of these. But whenever you end up filling these in, if you don't find your subdivision, like if you're typing this and you don't see an autofill underneath, or if you ended up doing, say this for instance, oops, we'll do Minchell Park and hit run search. And I see all of the different parts and pieces, and I wanted to actually grab a specific one. So this one right here, I'll hit fill. The autofill subdivision search is actually going to allow us to fill not just the subdivision itself, but also the township, range, and section, the county, the city, and even the school district itself. So it's going to save you guys a lot of time instead of having to find the township, range, and section, which just as a heads up, notice the way that these are formatted. 18 north is actually just 18N, no space. 13 east is 13, no space, E. And then of course the section is just 2 characters. But again, all of this was filled out based on the subdivision that I chose. Same thing goes with county, city, and again, that school district is filled in for me. Now, the year built, when we're looking at the property data form, the year built can come from one of 4 different sources. So when we're entering this, I'm just going to say it was 1986 and that it was coming over from the courthouse records. So we can use any of these 4 options. You do have to cite one of them at least, but let's say it's the owner. That is technically acceptable for the year built. We also have the schools all entered. I did want to point out when you guys are searching for schools, there may occasionally be some schools that are actually marked as closed. In fact, actually, let me see if I can find one real quick because there was one. There we go. Yeah, so anytime you guys see these where it says closed, those are not eligible to be used. Occasionally, what will end up happening is we'll have some people that'll try to use those closed schools entries. Maybe they thought that that school was going to be open still or whatever the case may be. But if we get a note from the school district saying that a certain school is going to be closed, we close it out as soon as possible. Because if that school is not going to be open for the next school year, we will mark it as closed because we need to know if a client ends up moving in there with their kids, what is the school that that child will be going to? Not where would they have been going to if they went in right now. We need to know where they'll be going to for perpetuity. Right. So I'm going to mark this as Rosewood, Good Central, and Broken Arrow. Oh, and again, here we go. Broken Arrow North, Broken Arrow South. Nope, it's just Broken Arrow now. The legal description also has its own little caveats. Occasionally, we may end up having people get in contact with us saying that the legal description isn't allowing it to be accepted. Might be something simple like LT4, BLK 3, something like that. If it doesn't hit the character minimum, you're going to have to put in some extra information. Our rules and regs actually have something specifically for that. Let me see if I can find it again. Yeah. Yeah, legal description. When the legal description is too long, at minimum, the section, township, range, and county, or the subdivision must be shown. So in this case, if I wanted to do just Minchell Park 3, I can put that in there. Or I can actually go through and just say Tulsa County, and then also 18 north, 13 east, and 10. Perfect. So I still end up hitting the minimum characters, but just so you guys are aware, any of the information that I've been entering so far, if I need to verify that it's actually going to accept what I've entered, there's a validate button down here at the very bottom. Now check out what happens when I end up hitting that validate button. So we've got status, property, rooms, so on and so forth. And none of these have any indication as to whether or not they're filled, even though very clearly I haven't even gotten there yet. But as soon as I click on validate, what it's going to do is it's actually going to go through and verify that each part and piece of the information that I've already entered is either correct or highlight any of the fields that I have not yet entered. So it's effectively an easy to-do list whenever we're actually filling out the listing data. So I could just say main drive. I need to put in the remainder of what the legal description will be. Let's even do this property subtype, list price. We'll do a list date, expiration date. Instead of no, multiple parcels, no. There we go. So when I click on validate, you'll notice that a whole bunch of those fields, so like our little red indicator here, all of the red indicators on this line and multiple parcels, all of that has been cleared out. Now, once you guys have actually put in all of the information that's required for a certain category, so like in this case, I'm on the rooms tab. There we go. I hit validate, and suddenly the red dot on that tab is actually gone. So again, this is a really easy way to make sure that if you guys haven't gotten everything filled out on a certain spot, I'll know to go back there and find out what it is that I'm missing. Also, if you do end up having any errors in how things are entered, they will actually give you a little warning by giving this little indicator. Occasionally, we'll have people get in contact with us and they're asking about the lot square, or the home square footage, because it'll give a little indicator saying, you know, hey, this isn't being accepted. And oftentimes it's because it has a comma in there. So if you guys do end up importing data over from Realist directly, so using that fill from Realist tax, it may end up putting a comma in there if it's in the thousands, and all you have to do is just remove that comma. In fact, actually, the warning message should indicate that that's what's needing to be corrected even. All right. So let's talk about this multiple parcels option. Multiple parcels is actually indicating to us that the property that we're going to be or the listing that we're going to be selling includes more than one parcel. They do not have to be contiguous. They do not have a limit for how many parcels you can sell all at once. The only stipulation is in regards to multiple parcels is going to be if you have one listing where there's multiple parcels being sold together, or you have multiple listings where all of those listings are either being able to be sold together, have to be sold together, or can be split off into separate purchases. So it all depends on what way you guys want to market this. You can either have multiple listings for one sale, or you can have one listing for multiple parcels that are being sold. Additionally, the home square footage has to come from one of 3 different sources. In fact, actually, maybe just by show of hands, how many of you guys already know what the 3 different sources are that you guys can use as a home square footage source? Just hit that raise hand button if you happen to know them by heart by now. That's perfectly fine. Again, I remember a lot of you guys are still relatively new. Oh, Glinda knows. Yeah, so there's three different sources that we can use. Oh, actually, let me find it again. There we go. So they have to come from one of three different sources. Stop highlighting. It has to come either from the, is this? There we go. County Assessor's Office, so the courthouse records, the building permit, which means that you actually have a copy of the building permit. Notice it actually says you have to have a copy of it, or an appraisal's square footage. So notice that both the building permit and the appraisal require that there is a full copy of the appraisal or a full copy of the building permit. What this means is that if you guys do not have one of those, we actually do have to put in 0 for the square footage. So when you guys get in here, if you do not have an appraisal, a copy of it, if you do not have the building permit, or if the courthouse records are no longer accurate, you're going to have to put in not reporting square feet. And again, this is all mentioned in our rules and regs. They have to come from one of those sources. If not, they cannot report it and they cannot mention it even in the public remarks. Now you can still give an estimate. So a lot of people will kind of wig out whenever they see that this is, something that they have to do. If you don't have the appraisal or the building report, they kind of are like, well, if the courthouse records is wrong, what am I supposed to do to indicate how large the house is? Well, the good news is there's a section up here at the top where you can provide an estimate. So if you guys do need to indicate how large the property is, you can still give it an estimate. The unfortunate circumstance is that this was actually something that we used to do the same exact way that we did the year built, where we had appraisal, builder, courthouse, or owner, until we had an owner that lied. They told us one number, the agent took them at their word, they didn't put in an appraisal. So what ended up happening is that the buyer ended up getting the house, getting an appraisal done, and finding out that they were shorted several hundred square feet. So not just a minor amount, but they actually overpaid for their property by a pretty substantial amount. So we ended up having to kind of hardline some rules and make sure that no one can enter a value that doesn't have evidence that that value is correct. Again, that's why we're requiring the copy of the appraiser, the copy of the building permit in order to put that in there. All right, number of stories is another one where I want to just point out, if you do have a property that has multiple floors to it, technically speaking, the number of stories for the house is actually going to be defined by the first floor's square footage. So as an example, if the square footage for the first floor is 1,000 square feet and the second floor is 1,000 square feet, that is technically a full 2-story house. If you have somebody that has a property that has 1,000 square feet on the ground floor and then 750 square feet on the second floor, what that means is that they technically have a 1.75 story house. Yes, the system does allow us to put in decimal points. No, you do not have to put this in as an exact number. You don't have to go through and find out, well, what's the square footage for the second floor? It's 637 square feet. I'm not going to have to put in 1.637 square feet if the first floor was 1,000 square feet. It gets even weirder when it's not just a nice even number like 1,000. So most of the time, you guys might notice that there's, some estimations effectively. 1.5 is safe. So even if it is just like there's a second floor and it's like, 80% of what the square footage is on the first floor, you can just put in 1.5 and still get away with it. We don't really monitor that as much, but we do want people to avoid just putting in 2 stories if the second floor is not as large as the first floor. Just put it in as 1.5 and call it a day. Number of fireplaces and the garage capacity are both going to be tied to elements that are going to be found elsewhere as well. So if I do end up citing what the garage capacity is, so if I put this on 0, and I go over here to the construction option, oops, clicked on the wrong one. It's not going to bother requiring me to put in what the garage description is. Watch what happens when I end up changing this over. If I end up putting in the garage capacity of 3, and then go back to my construction land area features, now I have to put in the garage description. So just bear that in mind, that if you guys end up noting something in one spot, there may be some other things that you're going to have to change. The same way that we did with the status In coming soon, it requires the showing start date. In active, it does not. Lot size is actually going to be determined by the square footage. We do get a lot of complaints about this. I promise there's a very logical reason for this. The square footage is going to be a lot more accurate. So what we're actually trying to clarify is that when you guys are entering a listing into the system, we want to have the square footage of the size of the property, not just the acres. Very notably, there's a county up in northern Oklahoma where they actually have been misusing the acres field for the properties to indicate how many parcels there were of the property before. So we noticed that there was, on average, a whole bunch of properties, or like the average size of the properties in that area was vastly larger than anywhere else. And it effectively boiled down to the fact that every single acres field for that entire county was a whole number. And almost all of them were just one, which just doesn't make any sense whatsoever. C'est la vie. What we require is that the square footage gets entered. Now, if you guys do only have the measurement of the size of the property by acres, not to worry. If you click on this little question mark icon, there's a little pop-up here, and it actually will tell us, all right, the acres is actually going to automatically be calculated based on the lot square footage. Okay, well, what's the lot square footage for my property? Click on the little question mark, or in this case, a little red indicator, and it's actually going to give you the math equation to be able to find out what the lot's square footage is. So even if you just have the acres, just grab the number of acres, times it by 43,560, and you'll have the lot's square footage. Put that number into here. Go. And whenever you guys end up saving it as incomplete, this number will automatically be converted into acres. Also, the tax amount, just put in whatever the estimate was for the last year. And let's now talk about our mapping. The mapping is exceedingly easy. It's just a matter of making sure that it's correct. So in this case, when you guys finally get to this step, there's an easy button down here at the bottom that says get lat long from address. A lot of people will end up just clicking that button, assuming that it's correct, and then moving on with their day. I want to say like 95% of the time, that's perfectly fine. But I am paranoid enough that that extra 5% is always going to bug me. So always double check your work by clicking on this set lat long manually. You don't even have to necessarily make any changes to it, but when I get into here, it's going to show me where it actually pinned this. And I can click on the parcel to make sure that it's the right spot. I can also move this around by clicking and dragging. And worst case scenario, if I do end up having a property that's just radically off the beaten path, and I want to make sure that I'm getting 123 North Main Street, I can hit locate, and it's going to try and pinpoint where that property is actually found. If that, again, is not correct, we can move this pin. We can even zoom in to a specific spot and hit place new pin so that it actually drops in the right location. But always zoom out. In fact, actually, let me see. I guess I shouldn't say I was lucky to find this, but there was actually a situation recently where I was teaching this ad edit class, and come to find out, there was a listing that it was currently mapped in Nebraska. And why was that? Well, because it was actually a Nebraska street that it was supposed to be mapped on. And the agent just hit the button that says get lat long from address, and then just left it. So it was just in a radically different state, and she didn't even know what was happening. So that's it for our thing. Also, just as a heads up, there is a negative in order to get us into this hemisphere. I've noticed a lot of people will import data from a previous listing, or even just try and copy paste the latitude and longitude from whatever tool they're happening to use, and they'll leave off that negative sign at the beginning. For a while there, we were actually noticing a lot of renewed listings, so like listings that had expired and then were being re-entered, were getting mapped in China, which, just as a fun fact, if I remove the lat long from there and hit update map, oops, man, every time I try to recreate this manually, it just doesn't want to work for me. There it goes. Okay. Here we go. I removed that little minus sign, and would you look at that? I've almost got it in the Haizi Mongol and Tibetan Autonomous Prefecture in China, in Qinghai, China. So please make sure that negative sign is there, unless you guys want your property to be listed in China, which we actually don't cover. That's not part of our jurisdiction, literally or figuratively. Anyway, let's move on now to the rooms section. I mentioned earlier that the rooms are actually going to have some contextual requirements. So you notice that whenever we ended up filling in just these required yellow fields up at the top, that was it for rooms. That's the first checkbox that we actually got rid of, or the first little warning symbol that we got rid of. Down below, we do have a room description where we can put in, let's say that we wanted to mark the master bedroom, that it has separate closets. If I just leave it at that, so I don't put in the level and hit validate, it's going to require that I put in the level that that particular room is on. So I'm going to say that's on the second floor. As soon as we hit that validate, or if we hit more, it's going to start adding in more options for us. So master bath, it's got a fireplace. Wait, a fireplace in the master bathroom? I mean, I guess if I ever accidentally made the fire spill out of the fireplace, I could just use the shower head to put it out. Anyway, seems like that might be in the wrong spot, but I got to make sure that I note where it is. And again, if I want to add more rooms, I just have to keep hitting more, make sure that I get everything noted where it's physically located. There we go, and so on and so forth. So again, hit validate. It makes sure that everything is correct. And we can move on to the broker disclosure finance warranty. Now, each of these is going to have a relatively specific meaning. And I did want to let you guys know there's always going to be a little question mark icon next to every single field that we have in this entire system. So if you guys don't know what it means when it says internet list, just click on this and it'll let you know what that means. This is literally the option that allows us to get this property syndicated out to third-party websites like Realtor.com, Zillow, Trulia, Redfin, et cetera, et cetera. So if you do not set this to yes, your listing will go to no one in the public. The only people that will actually be able to see it are the people that are signed into the MLS, which is not ideal. This allow AVM is also how you turn off Zillow's estimates. So just as a heads up, AVM stands for Automated Valuation Model. If you turn this to no, Zillow will not provide his estimate for this property. We had a lot of questions about that, so we put this little option in there, and I would suggest putting it to no unless you're pretty confident that you got the property marked at the right price and everyone else does as well. HOA information, I did mention that there was the contextual requirement. You notice that if I set this to no, hit validate, it clears the tab. Meanwhile, if I switch this over to yes and hit validate, now all of a sudden I've got to change what the HOA fee was, $350. If I hit validate again, now it's going to be asking what the HOA fee was or what the schedule is. If I end up putting in some of these other options, it's going to be asking other things. It's just remember that each thing might actually have something that's tied to it that's going to have to be validated. There we go, got that one cleared. Construction land, I don't know why this has been such a trend recently. I think people are just trying to put too many listings in too quickly, but a lot of people have just been going through here and just marking other on everything. Please don't do this. There are people out there that want to know whether or not there's a covered patio or not, want to know whether or not there's, some other features on there. And so if you go through and just put in none or other or something like that, and it doesn't happen to be true because there is at least one of these options on there, you might not get connected with the right buyer because they're looking for that particular thing. Also, just as a heads up, I had long thought that we were no longer going to have a architectural styles class. I had actually errantly been told that the woman that had been teaching that class died of COVID. Thank God that appears not to be the case. On June 29th, we are actually going to have another architectural styles class hosted here at GTAR. Strongly recommend that you guys come and check that out because a lot of people have been marking their listings incorrectly, thinking that contemporary just means that it's something that was made recently when contemporary actually has a very specific style aesthetic, meaning that there's certain parts and pieces of that style that have to be obliged if they're going to be marked as contemporary. So anyway, most of these are going to be, again, relatively self-explanatory. And if they don't make sense, just click on the little question mark and you guys can find out more. The final step is going to be adding in the list comments. Make sure that your public remarks are limited to just 510 characters. As we are typing that public remarks, it'll count down those characters for you. So the easiest way for you guys to verify that is either to fill it in Microsoft Word, where there's a character counter at the bottom of your screen, or you guys can just fill it in the listing itself directly. The directions are required. We also have been noticing a lot of people have been putting in put in GPS or Google/Apple Maps is accurate, or for some reason, the recent trend is to actually put in the GPS coordinates. This is not helpful information, and it's kind of for a relatively surprising reason, at least surprising to me. I kind of take smartphones and GPS for granted. There are a surprisingly large number of realtors who are still using flip phones and do not have access to a GPS. They will literally just still be running out there with a map. So if you guys don't want to end up hurting some broker or agent or someone out there that's still got their atlas that they're using to drive everywhere in rural communities, please make sure that you guys put in good turn-by-turn directions. And as much as a joke this kind of sounds, the easiest way to try and find a central location is either to go from the nearest large town, or worst case scenario, find out where the nearest Dollar Tree is and get the directions from that location, because there's a Dollar Tree everywhere. Might as well, right? Anyway, so once we're done with all of the information on here, we can just hit the submit listing. That means that all of the details will be submitted immediately. And if you have this set as coming soon, it'll be coming soon and automatically change over to active on the showing start date. If you have this set to active, the moment you hit submit listing, it is currently in the system, it's currently active, and within the next probably hour, everywhere else on the internet will end up having that listing as well. If you do end up finding that, oh, you know what, I need to fill the rest of this information out later, I got to do the rest of this later, or I got a closing to go to, a showing to go to, whatever, hit this save as incomplete option. What that'll do is give you an MLS number, and we can come back to that MLS number later by just going, let's say I left, add edit, whatever. I can go back to add edit, put in that listing number, hit edit, and now I can fill out the remainder of my information under the residential form. I can also go through the process of putting in virtual tours, managing the photos, adding the disclosures and other documents, even putting in all the details for showing time so that we can have a showing dates ready to go as soon as it goes live. But again, just as a reminder, you have to fill out all the information and then hit submit listing in order for this to go active or coming soon. Now, I did want to point out what to do with a listing that's already in the system and already active. Once you guys have a listing that's active and it's maybe got the sales contract signed by both the buyer and the seller, you're going to have to come back here to either put it into contingent or put it into pending. Either one of those is going to require the exact same details. What is the pending date? What is the anticipated closing date? And who's going to be on the selling end? If you do not find the selling agent in our system at all, verify with them that they're a member of our MLS. And if they are not, you can use non-MLS. Hit refresh. It's going to have a non-MLS associate option so that you guys can still put the listing in pending, even if they are not a member of our MLS. Additionally, just so you guys are aware, pending date today, I'm going to say the anticipated closing date is in a week. There we go. Hit submit listing. Once a listing has actually gone into pending, the system will be monitoring that pending closing date, so the anticipated closing date. And if it comes to that time, so like it's, you know, the 29th now or the 30th or whatever, Matrix will start sending you warnings, messages and stuff. In order to change that anticipated closing date, just have to go back and do change to pending, and then just update the closing date to whatever the date was intended to be, or is now intended to be. Easy peasy. And of course, once the listing is closed, you guys can just jump back into the listing, go down here to sold, and you're going to be required to put in some extra details. If the system does not let you actually put in the listings closed because it was below 40% of the listed price, it's going to prevent you from doing that. So like if I accidentally put in, oh, it's sold for $100 instead of $1,000, it's going to actually give you a little error. It's going to say, wait a second, this is actually below 40% of the list price. So it'll prevent you from accidentally doing something that'll hurt, the listing data. But beyond that, I'm going to be sending you guys some tutorials that are going to go over how to rearrange photos and upload disclosures and a couple other things that are going to be necessary along the way. But those are the key elements that I wanted to cover today for our ad edit class. I'm also going to be including a little effectively like quick start guide with some of the key things that you guys need to remember whenever you're adding listings into the system, some of the important rules that we want to make sure that people are aware of, as well as some links to some extra documents kind of describing some further details. It's only an hour-long class, so we have a limited amount of time to kind of cover things, but these are the most important stuff that we wanted to cover. So that's it for our class today. If everybody could hit that raise hand button, just to let me know that you guys are still here. I'll use that to justify our CE credit today, so I do need to see everybody's hand up. But after you guys have hit that raise hand button, you guys can cut and run. I appreciate you guys joining us today. And if you have any questions at all, please get in contact with us over at the service desk. I'll put our contact information up on the screen, and I will see you guys in the future. So I think, oh yeah, that's it. Jasmine, I think you're probably still on that same internet connection from earlier, but if you wouldn't mind hitting the raise hand button whenever you hear me. But everybody else can head out. Thank you guys so much again. Please reach out to us if you have any questions or problems. We're more than willing to help. If you guys have any issues with getting a listing put in, get that MLS change form submitted. But hopefully we'll see you in future classes. Stay safe, keep social distancing, wear your mask in crowded places, and hopefully we'll see you in future classes. Have a good one, guys. Oh, and Julia, if you don't have access, your broker will have to actually submit a form to us. That can actually be found when you go to that forms and contracts link on the MLS portal. There's going to be a button here that says membership forms. The one that they're going to have to fill out is this MLS Tech Add Edit Authorization. So MLS Tech Add Edit Authorization. This will require the broker's signature though. So make sure that everything is filled out and then send it over to your broker. They put their signature on it, send that back into the email address or the fax number that we have at the top, and you'll be good to go. And again, it's really simple. We get it added on there within like a matter of minutes. It's very easy. Yeah, no problem at all. So Jasmine, I'm not sure if you can hear me, but again, if you wouldn't mind hitting that raise hand button, I just want to know that you're still here. But um, all right, I'm going to go ahead and close up shop. Have a good one.